I never thought I would witness something as incredible and at the same time as human as what happened to Alejandro that Saturday. It was his wedding day. Everything meticulously planned. A luxurious buffet, live musicians, a setting worthy of a magazine cover. He had spent years building the image of a successful, cold, almost untouchable man, but behind the impeccable appearance there was a wound that he himself was nurturing. The history with Carmen was one of those wounds. They had dated in the past, when they had nothing yet, and he, out of wounded pride or inflated ego, thought it would be a good idea to invite her to the wedding, just to show how much he had succeeded without her. But the surprise began when he found out, by chance, that Carmen had confirmed her presence and would bring 3 children with her. Alejandro had no idea that she had children, let alone that they could be his. When he learned that the boys were identical and of the same age, the impact was immediate. He turned pale. It hit him like a hammer blow. 3 6-year-old boys, all with the face he used to see in the mirror when he was a child. The ceremony hadn't even started yet, but Alejandro was already in another dimension, emotionally speaking. It was as if the ground had opened beneath his feet, and no one there yet knew what was about to happen. He tried to hide his nervousness, but it was clear that something was wrong. While the guests were taking photos and the waiters were serving champagne, Alejandro discreetly stepped away, cell phone in hand, looking for any trace of that story that could be confirmed. He searched through old messages, emails, until he remembered a box with letters he had received years ago but never opened. The one who always took care of the correspondence was Sophia, his partner and trusted advisor. She said she filtered everything so that he wouldn't waste time on nonsense. At the time, he was grateful. Now, he only felt a chill down his spine. That's when he decided to look for her. He found Sophia backstage at the hall, coordinating the ceremonial team as she always did, with that calm firmness of someone who believes they have everything under control. When Alejandro asked directly if she knew anything about Carmen and those children, she froze for a second. It was subtle, but he noticed. He insisted, lowering his tone, and she eventually confessed. For years, Carmen had tried to get in touch, letters, photos, even calls. But Sophia intercepted everything. She thought she was protecting Alejandro, according to her own explanation. She believed that he didn't need emotional distractions during the peak of his career. There, in that stifling corridor, he realized that he had not only lost 6 years with his children, but that someone very close had decided that for him. The revelation was like a punch. Alejandro stood still, staring into nothingness, as if he had been struck by a blow he didn't know how to react to. He didn't shout, didn't cry. He just remained silent for a few minutes, trying to understand how all of this could have happened without him noticing. The anger came afterwards, a mixture of indignation and guilt. He had always trusted Sophia blindly, and now he was faced with the fact that she had manipulated not only his routine, but his entire history. Without saying anything more, he simply moved away from her, leaving behind the glitter of the event and the security of the control he had always known. Meanwhile, Carmen arrived. She was wearing a simple yet elegant dress, and the 3 boys came alongside her, each holding onto her hand or a part of her dress. They were curious, a little agitated, like any child arriving at a place full of lights and unfamiliar people. The guests were watching, many not understanding who these very similar children were, who were now walking toward the main entrance. Carmen seemed firm, but anyone paying close attention would see the tension in her jaw and shoulders. She didn't know how Alejandro would react. She only knew that finally, after years of being ignored, he would have to look into his own children's eyes. Alejandro saw them from afar. He stopped, as if time had slowed down around him. The 3 boys were running towards a group of balloons, laughing, pointing at things with that childlike curiosity that only children have. And it was at that moment that he saw in them something that no one else could see, a hand gesture, a way of frowning, a laugh identical to that of his grandfather. It was as if the DNA had shouted. He didn't need a test, nor confirmation. The truth was there, glaring in the faces that looked like copies of his own, and that disarmed him. The cold, calculating man simply did not know what to do with that. For a moment, he thought of leaving, to get in his car, vanish, pretend that nothing of the sort was happening. But he stayed. He sat on a bench by the garden and kept watching. He saw Carmen, waved to him with an almost imperceptible wave, without smiles, without expectation. It was a gesture of someone who only wanted to close a cycle, and he understood. He got up and walked to her. The journey seemed longer than any negotiation or meeting he had ever faced. When he stopped in front of her, he couldn't say anything. He only looked at the boys, who were now looking at him curiously, as if trying to guess who that man in a suit was, who seemed so uncomfortable. Carmen broke the silence. With a simple phrase, "These are Tomas, Gael, and Bruno." Nothing more. She didn't explain anything, nor demand any explanations. She simply introduced her children. Alejandro felt a lump in his throat. He tried to smile, but the smile didn't come out right. He bent down to be at the boy's level and extended his hand as if he were in an interview. They looked at their mother, waiting for some confirmation. Carmen nodded her head, and then the three shook his hand, one by one. It was strange, too formal for such an intimate moment, but it was the only gesture he could offer. It was as if the instinct of a father had been triggered too late, and he didn't know how to act. The ceremony hadn't even started yet, but for Alejandro, that wedding no longer made sense. Everything that had been prepared there, flowers, rings, speeches, had lost its weight. He distanced himself from Carmen and the children for a moment and went to the bride, Isabella. The two talked in private, and no one knows exactly what was said. What was later known was that the wedding was cancelled right there, minutes before it was to begin. No scandal, no announcement, just cancelled. Some guests were irritated, others confused, but Alejandro seemed calm, as if he had finally understood that he was making the first real decision of his life. And that decision was not about status, but about regaining lost time. After the guests began to leave, Carmen was preparing to do the same. She had no intention of prolonging it, much less of creating any embarrassment, but Alejandro called her with a look more humble than she remembered having seen in him. He asked, almost in a whisper, that she and the boys stay a little longer. He said he wanted to talk. Carmen hesitated, but the children were entertained with the flowers and the sweets left on the tables. She ended up agreeing. They sat in a corner of the now empty hall and spoke for the first time as two adults who needed to settle accounts with the past. He asked why she had never told him. She replied without changing her tone that she had tried, that she had written, called, sent photos, asked acquaintances for help, and that, after years of silence, she simply gave up. She had a career, 3 children, and a life to lead. "You disappeared," she said, looking him straight in the eyes. Alejandro did not defend himself. He simply nodded, digesting that phrase like a stone in his stomach. For the first time, he saw everything he had refused to see before. The absence, the arrogance, the way he had shielded himself from any involvement that wasn't profitable. And now, faced with the reality that had slipped through his fingers, all that was left for him was to listen. The children were sitting on the floor of the hall, playing with pieces of ribbon and colored napkins. They didn't understand the weight of what was happening there, but they could feel the change in the air. Every now and then, they looked at their parents, trying to decipher whether it was safe to keep playing or if something bad was about to happen. Alejandro watched them intently, trying to absorb every detail. The sound of the laughter, the way one of them stumbled and laughed at himself, How another grew serious while folding a paper airplane. It was too much information to process in such a short time, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel what he had perhaps hidden for years, the emptiness of a fatherhood he never lived. It was at that moment that he got up and went to the boys. He sat on the floor, informally, beside them. Carmen watched from afar, without interfering. Alejandro wasn't quite sure what to say, so he started asking simple things. The names of their favorite superheroes, what they liked to eat the most, whether they had any pets. The conversation flowed in the way that conversations with children usually do, with sincerity, distractions, and some questions he didn't know how to answer. When the boys asked if he was going to leave or if he would come back another day, Alejandro froze. He swallowed hard and said with a choked voice that he wanted to always be present if they allowed him. It was the first true promise he made that day. Carmen approached, took one of the empty chairs, and sat down next to him. She did not interfere in the conversation, but watched attentively, trying to decipher whether this was real or just another impulsive moment from Alejandro. She knew well the man he had been, ambitious, proud, always chasing something bigger, but there, sitting on the floor with the children, was something else. Perhaps exhaustion, or a genuine desire to fix what was broken. When the boys began to call him uncle without really knowing who he was, he calmly corrected them, saying, "I am your father. I didn't know, but now I do, and I really want to learn how to be." It was direct, without embellishment. Carmen looked at him and, even without saying anything, something inside her gave way. After a while, the boys were already exhausted. It was almost night, and the hall was beginning to be taken down by the cleaning crew. Carmen got up and called her children. Alejandro accompanied them to the car, as if he didn't want that moment to end. He asked for her phone number, promised that he would call the next day. Carmen wrote the number on a napkin, the only piece of paper she found at that moment, and handed it over with a look that mixed distrust and hope. There were no hugs, no kisses, just a timid wave from the boys through the car window and a heavy silence as the car drove away. Alejandro stood there, watching the taillights disappear around the corner, not knowing if that had been a new beginning or just an isolated chapter. When he returned inside the hall, everything seemed different. The flowers were still there, the porcelain plates untouched, the luxurious arrangements, but none of that made sense anymore. Alejandro walked to the empty altar where the ceremony was supposed to take place and stood there for a few minutes. He thought about everything he had lost. 6 years, first steps, first words, birthdays, nights when someone was sick, drawings on the wall. All of that had passed without him, and as much as he now had the boys in his life, he couldn't erase the absence. The guilt overwhelmed him in a new way, different from any business failure. That couldn't be fixed with money. When he returned to the office that same night, the first thing he did was open that box of letters. It was at the back of a closet where Sophia kept personal documents. There were dozens of envelopes, some yellowed, others with childish drawings. He opened them one by one, reading with the attention of someone trying to reconstruct a time that was gone. He saw photos of the babies, scribbles made by little hands with captions like "Daddy," and short accounts of difficult nights, school achievements, medical appointments. Carmen had tried everything, and he, in his bubble of success and control, hadn't noticed anything. He cried right there, silently, alone. It was a restrained cry, more bitter than sad, a cry that mixed loss and shame. That same early morning, Alejandro wrote an email to his legal team requesting the immediate termination of the partnership contract with Sophia. There was no room for hesitation. He did not mention the personal reasons in the document. He simply stated, "irreparable breach of trust." Then he opened another tab on his computer and started researching schools, health plans, and toys suitable for the children's age. He wasn't quite sure what he was doing, but he needed to start somewhere. It was like learning to walk again, only with the awareness that 3 little ones were looking up to him now. And this time, he wanted them to look up to him with pride. Before sleeping, almost at dawn, he took the napkin on which Carmen had written her number. He had read that piece of paper so many times that he knew it by heart. He thought of calling at that moment, but it would be intrusive. He put it in the pocket of his trousers and lay down on the office sofa, without changing his clothes, without turning off the light. He slept with his mind racing, trying to understand how life had changed so much in such a few hours. It all began as a power play, a petty attempt to show that he had succeeded. But it ended with him, alone on a sofa, holding a crumpled napkin with a number that was worth more than any contract or stock. It was the beginning of something. He just didn't know exactly what. The next morning, Alejandro woke up with the strange feeling that it had all been a dream. But the papers on the table, the scattered photos, and the napkin in his pocket confirmed that it was real. He got up with a heavy body, but with a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in years, he had no scheduled meetings, nor did he need to. Pretend to be in control. He picked up his cell phone, hesitated for a few seconds, and then called Carmen. The call went to voicemail. He tried again. On the 3rd attempt, she answered with a voice still sleepy but firm. He didn't know what to say immediately. He simply asked to see them again. Carmen was silent for a few seconds and then said yes, that they could talk later. It was a beginning. While getting ready, without his usual haste, Alejandro noticed one of the photos that Carmen had sent, a photo in which the boys were wearing identical t-shirts, smiling, with crooked teeth and eyes squeezed shut from laughing so hard. He picked up the image, made a copy, and placed it in a picture frame on his desk. Next to it, he put the scribbled drawing of Daddy that had come along with one of the letters. That for anyone else might have seemed like a simple piece of child decoration. But for him, it was a milestone. The confirmation that the man he used to be had ended there, at that empty altar, and that now another was beginning to be built, slower, more insecure, but much more real. The meeting with Carmen took place in the late afternoon. When Alejandro arrived at the agreed place, he saw that she was already there, waiting on a bench in a quiet square. The boys were playing in an area surrounded by trees, running aimlessly, laughing without knowing that this was also a chance for the two of them. Carmen raised her head when he approached, but she did not smile. She simply looked at him with a mixture of caution and curiosity, as if expecting him to finally do something he should have done years ago. But Alejandro had no ready answers. He only had a sense of urgency about being there, and that was all. They talked for quite a while. It wasn't an easy conversation. Carmen, with the frankness of someone who has suffered a lot, asked some direct questions. Why now? Why only after so much time? And more importantly, what did he really want? Alejandro, however, he couldn't answer immediately. He didn't know what he wanted. What he did know was what he felt, and that was something new for him, a feeling he couldn't control, something that made him care deeply about what, until then, had seemed secondary. Gradually, Carmen began to open up, also without the rush to resolve everything in one day. There were more things to discuss, but at that moment, she no longer wanted to hear empty promises. The most important thing in that meeting was not what was said, but what was not said. The connection, timidly, was beginning to be rebuilt there between simple words and careful gestures. Alejandro, who had always been a man of great achievements, now knew that his greatest achievement would be to build something genuine, even if it was small, even if it took time. He wasn't in a hurry. What concerned him most now was ensuring that the boys felt that he was there to stay, not as a savior, but as a father. And finally, Carmen looked at him with a lightness in her eyes that he had never seen before. Life, after all, wasn't just about control or power. Sometimes it was just about taking one step at a time. The following week, Alejandro began to visit the children regularly. Not every day, but enough so that they started to recognize him and in some way accept him into their lives. The first time he took them to the park, one of the boys, Gael, stayed quiet, watching him with genuine distrust. But Tomas and Bruno, more outgoing, began to ask simple questions, as if he were just another adult with whom they would play. There was nothing extraordinary about it, but for Alejandro, that was the beginning of a real bond. Over time, he became part of their routine, the trips to the park, the visits to the zoo, the movies on the weekend. With every new moment, he felt more integrated, but also more aware of his lack of history with them. He wasn't there to replace anyone, not to take the place of an ever-present father, but to be what he could be, a man who was just beginning to learn how to be a father. Carmen, watching from a distance, noticed the change. She didn't demand that he be perfect. She knew no one ever would. But she wanted to see if he was really willing to invest in what could be a new beginning without empty promises. It was on one of those afternoons that he finally mustered the courage to ask Carmen what she thought about him spending the night with the boys at her house. She hesitated, but agreed. It wasn't just Alejandro's presence that was being tested, but also her trust, built with so much effort over the years. That night, the boys slept peacefully on the makeshift mattresses on the living room floor, and Alejandro remained silent, watching them sleep. For the first time, he felt the weight of what it meant to be a father, and the relief, too, of knowing that there was still time to try to do things the right way. The following days turned into a routine that gradually solidified. Alejandro was learning to be more present, more attentive, more patient. With every small gesture, like making breakfast, tidying up scattered toys, or even telling bedtime stories, he felt that he was closer to his children. Not that he was perfect, far from it, but the change was visible. The change in him, in the way he saw himself, in the way the world seemed to have another perspective when he focused on the little things. He was moving away from his previous life, that life of business, endless meetings, and an insatiable pursuit of power. What he didn't know was that this internal transformation had been more important to him than any award or recognition he had ever received. Carmen, for her part, watched even more closely. She wasn't fooled by empty promises or momentary emotional gestures. She knew that trust wasn't rebuilt in an hour. Still, there was something new in the way Alejandro was committing to this new dynamic. He was trying, and that, as simple as it was, already meant a lot. She still wasn't sure if she could fully trust him, but she could already see in the small actions that there was something real there. Life went on, and gradually she began to realize that she could allow herself to believe in a different future. With him, with the boys, with all of them. Maybe forgiveness was possible, maybe love could, in some way, blossom, but time would tell. It was on a Sunday afternoon, after a simple lunch at Carmen's house, that they finally decided to do something, together as a family. It wasn't a grand event, but for them, it was a great achievement. With the children running around the living room, distracted by a new game that Alejandro had bought for them, Carmen and he sat at the table in silence, but with a calmness they had never experienced before. There were no more heavy words between them, nor discussions about the past, only the feeling that they were, somehow, rebuilding something that seemed lost. And for the first time, the future seemed more promising than the past. A few months passed since that quiet Sunday. Alejandro's visits to Carmen's house became frequent, and he began to notice that each new day the boys seemed more at ease with him. Gael, the most reserved, still watched him cautiously, but had already started asking more personal questions, like why he didn't live with them. Alejandro, patiently, explained that he was learning to be a father and that he wanted to be part of their lives, but that this process would take time. The other two, Tomas and Bruno, already treated him as a constant figure. Sometimes they even called him Daddy, something he hadn't expected, but which deeply touched him. It wasn't a word thrown around casually, but a genuine affirmation of the new reality they were creating together. Carmen, who had always been the backbone of the family, now began to make room for Alejandro, but without haste. She still held her reservations. It was hard to fully trust after so much lost time, after so many mistakes made. However, she also saw that he was changing. He was no longer the cold and distant man she had known in the past, but someone who seemed willing to pay the price for what he had left behind. And, as life went on with its ups and downs, Carmen allowed herself to dream of the possibility of one day seeing her family rebuilt, not as a reminder of what might have been, but as something alive and present. She knew there were more challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt that things could work out. In this new rhythm, Alejandro began to invest in more than just his physical presence. He became actively involved in the boys' lives. He accompanied them in swimming lessons, helped with homework, and even started teaching Gael how to ride a bicycle, something the boy had always been afraid to try. Every small achievement of theirs was, for Alejandro, a personal victory. He no longer focused on the big goals of his company or the numbers in his bank account. The daily victories, the children's laughter, the sense of belonging were all he needed now. That internal transformation wasn't something that could be bought with money, and he finally understood that. On a rainy Saturday morning, after a simple breakfast, Carmen suggested that they spend the day together, all at her house. Alejandro agreed without hesitation. It wasn't something grand, but for him, at that moment, it was enough. The children were excited, playing board games while he and Carmen sat in the kitchen, talking about how things were going. The conversation was light, without any major discussions or tensions. For the first time, it seemed that both of them were truly on the same team, working together for the sake of the children. Carmen, with a timid smile, commented on how the boys had started asking to see Alejandro more, saying they missed him when he wasn't around. He didn't know what to say, but his chest filled with a pride he had never known. It was as if, finally, he had found his true purpose. As the afternoon passed, he devoted himself to what now seemed to be his new normal, accompanying the boys in everything they did, listening to their stories about school, their inventions, and even their small disagreements. When the day was drawing to a close, Alejandro realized that he no longer wanted to leave. It wasn't a matter of wanting to control or conquer, but of truly being present in a genuine way. The boys were getting used to his presence, and he, gradually, was understanding that perhaps the greatest gift he could give them was simply to be constant. That night, when the boys were already asleep, Alejandro and Carmen sat on the living room sofa, in silence. There were no more heavy words or questions about the past, only the gentle sound of rain outside and the warmth of a coexistence that, even though still fragile, was beginning to solidify. Alejandro, with his head resting against the back of the sofa, closed his eyes for a moment. He knew that the road would be long and full of challenges, but for the first time in many years, he felt at peace with himself. Redemption, he understood at that moment, wasn't about erasing the past, but about building something new, something stronger. And over time, he believed that everyone involved would be able to rebuild trust, relationships, and above all, the family. At the end of that month, Alejandro made a decision. He wanted to take a firmer step toward the future. He no longer wanted to live in a limbo between the past and what could be. So, he set out to formalize his relationship with Carmen and the boys, not with a commitment ring or an adoption document, but with a simple yet significant gesture. With the help of a friend, he planned a small ceremony at Carmen's house, where he and the children would share an afternoon together, symbolizing not only his commitment to them, but his full acceptance of his new role in the family. It wouldn't be something grand, but it had everything to do with the moment they were in. That day, Carmen and the boys were calmer than he had imagined. There were no grand speeches or big declarations. The children were excited about the birthday cake they had made together earlier, and he, deep down, felt that this small event, more than any other symbolic gesture, would truly mark the beginning of his new life. They all sat around the table, laughed, played, and even argued a little about who would eat the most. Cake. As he looked at them, he saw a reflection of what he had always wanted, but never knew how to achieve. A simple life, but with deep roots. And there, at that moment, without the pressure of high expectations, he felt that he was in the right place. He was no longer the ambitious millionaire who had lost control of his life, but a man who saw himself in the reflection of those children, trying to be someone better, more present, more real. Carmen, by his side, still with a look of distrust, but also of hope, allowed herself for the first time to believe that something different could come from this new journey. Over time, the scars of both, from their differences and what they had lost, began to heal, slowly, like a wound that, although never completely disappearing, no longer hurt as much. Life, which before had seemed uncontrollable, was becoming simpler, more human. Alejandro finally learned that the things most worth having aren't in the numbers in his bank account or in million-dollar contracts, but in the silent moments of genuine connection, in the children's smiles, and in the feeling of belonging. And, as life went on, he knew that the journey was only just beginning. But for the first time, he wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. Redemption, he realized, was precisely in that simple act of living, of being present. And that day, that small gesture of coming together with his family would be the foundation for everything that would come next.